Germany had surrendered. The flags were up, the crowds were cheering, and the generals were congratulating each other. But George Patton was standing at a map of Central Europe with an expression that nobody who saw it would describe as victory. On the morning of May 8, 1945, as the world erupted in celebration, Patton told his staff that the briefing that day would be the last in Europe. He was not relieved. He was not at peace. By his own account, he already knew something that Washington had not yet decided to admit. The war that the politicians had declared finished was not finished. Not for the men still trapped east of a line that no one had drawn carefully enough. And not for Patton himself. What he was watching move across that map was not a parade. It was a problem. To understand what Patton saw on VE Day, you have to understand what the Third Army had done to get there. In 281 days of combat, Patton's force had advanced more than 1,300 miles across North Africa and Western Europe. It had crossed the Rhine without air support, without artillery preparation, without the elaborate orchestration that Field Marshal Montgomery had assembled for his own crossing. Patton had simply crossed because he believed in movement, and movement, to his mind, was the answer to almost every military problem. By the first week of May 1945, the Third Army stood at its greatest strength, 18 divisions, more than 540,000 men, poised at the Czech border. Patton believed they could reach Prague in under 24 hours. Bradley believed the same. Eisenhower refused the order. The halt was political. Soviet forces were already moving toward Czechoslovakia, and the agreements made at Yalta in February had drawn lines that American commanders were not permitted to cross, regardless of whether their armies could get there first. This was not an isolated decision. It was part of a pattern that Patton had been watching with increasing alarm since the late winter of 1945. Every time the Third Army surged east, political calculations pulled it back. At the Elbe, at Pilsen, at the Czech border. Each halt ceded territory, population, and strategic position to Soviet forces that were not stopping, were not negotiating, and were not subject to the same diplomatic restraint being applied to the Americans. Patton had watched the Soviet advance with professional attention and growing personal fury. He understood the military grammar of what was happening. Ground taken in war is ground kept in peace. And the Soviets, in the spring of 1945, were taking an enormous amount of ground, with no apparent intention of giving any of it back. The war in Europe officially ended at 1 minute past midnight on May 9, 1945. But what Patton was watching did not end. It transformed. The celebration of VE Day masked a problem that would define the next 40 years of European history, and Patton appears to have grasped its shape before almost anyone else in uniform. At his press conference on May 8, Patton pointed to a map of Central Europe and made remarks that were so politically dangerous they were omitted or softened in most subsequent accounts. The substance of what he communicated that day was clear, that the Western Allies had defeated one totalitarian system while simultaneously enabling the expansion of another. The historical record gives us the broad outline of what he said, even if the exact wording of every sentence is not preserved in a single clean transcript. He told the officers and correspondents present that by stopping where they had stopped, the Allied armies had missed what he called a date with destiny. He believed the problem now sitting to the east of the American lines was not smaller than the one they had just destroyed. It was, in his assessment, comparable, possibly larger. But this philosophical alarm was accompanied by something more immediate and more concrete, and it was the concrete dimension that gave the philosophical one its weight. Under the agreements signed at Yalta in February 1945, the Soviet Union and the Western Allies had committed to a mutual repatriation of liberated prisoners of war. American prisoners freed by Soviet forces from German camps were to be separated from enemy prisoners immediately and returned to Allied control without delay. The Soviets had made the same promise in writing. The promise was not kept with anything approaching consistency. As the spring of 1945 unfolded, American officers attempting to account for their men discovered something that did not fit the narrative of a clean and total victory. The prisoner exchange process in the Soviet zone was slow, incomplete, bureaucratically tangled in ways that looked less like administrative incompetence and more like deliberate management. Men who had survived years in German camps were now somewhere on the Soviet side of a boundary that American officers could not freely cross, being processed through systems that did not answer American requests on any predictable timetable. The exact numbers were disputed then and remain difficult to establish precisely. What is not disputed is that the accounting did not add up, and Patton, who had spent 3 years fighting to bring his men home, was not a general who accepted incomplete accounting. Patton's response to the post-victory landscape was characteristic. He did not wait. He did not defer to diplomatic channels. He applied the same urgent intelligence to the political problem that he had applied to every military obstacle since North Africa. His starting point was the Yalta Agreement itself. Signed in February 1945, it had committed both sides to what sounded, on paper, like a clean and reciprocal arrangement. American prisoners liberated in Soviet-controlled territory were to be collected at designated assembly points, cared for, and handed over to American representatives without delay. Soviet citizens liberated by Western forces were to receive the same treatment in reverse. The agreement was specific. It used direct language. It contained no ambiguity about the obligation. The reality, as American officers discovered in the spring of 1945, was considerably messier. Soviet commanders in the field did not always treat liberated American prisoners as a category requiring special attention or rapid transfer. In some cases, American ex-prisoners found themselves absorbed into the general chaos of Soviet-controlled displaced persons movements, moving with columns of civilians and former prisoners of other nationalities, subject to Soviet administrative procedures that bore little resemblance to what the Yalta text had promised. Access for American liaison officers to Soviet-held camps and collection points was inconsistent and, in some areas, effectively denied. The question of how many Americans were affected and in what precise circumstances was contested at the time and has remained so. The Rand Corporation, in its post-war analysis of the POW and MIA issue, acknowledged the difficulty of establishing firm numbers and noted that the recovery of Americans from Soviet-controlled territory in 1945 was significantly incomplete relative to what the Yalta Agreement had been designed to ensure. Estimates of Americans not accounted for through normal repatriation channels ranged widely, and the surviving record does not provide a single authoritative figure. What it does establish is that the problem was real, that it was recognized by American military authorities, and that the diplomatic response to it was cautious to the point of paralysis. This caution had a logic. Washington in the summer of 1945 was still navigating the belief, held by Roosevelt and not yet abandoned by Truman, that the Soviet-American alliance could be preserved into the post-war period. Pressing Stalin publicly and aggressively over prisoner handling would have been understood as a destabilizing move. The political cost of confrontation was judged to be higher than the political cost of incomplete accounting. State Department communications from the period reflect a sustained reluctance to push the Soviet side hard on specific cases. Patton found this calculation intolerable. He had spent years telling his soldiers that if they were captured, America would come for them. The Yalta Agreement had been the formal expression of that promise. What he saw happening was not the fulfillment of that promise, but its quiet renegotiation, conducted by men in Washington who, in his view, had never spent a day close enough to the front to understand what a promise to a soldier actually meant. His conversations with Allied and American officers in this period, as reconstructed from diaries, letters, and post-war accounts, consistently returned to the same axis of frustration, the willingness of the political leadership to accept Soviet non-compliance rather than force a confrontation. In a letter to his wife in October 1945, he described Eisenhower's posture toward Soviet conduct with undisguised contempt. His diary, maintained through the final months of his life, repeatedly returns to the spread of Soviet power and what he interpreted as Washington's unwillingness to acknowledge what it meant. By the summer of 1945, Patton had begun to think in terms that went beyond tactical frustration. He had, according to post-war accounts and his own writing, concluded that the decision to halt the American advance at politically convenient lines, rather than militarily defensible ones, had created a situation that would require another confrontation to resolve. He did not use the word Cold War. That phrase did not yet exist, but the strategic reality he was describing in the summer of 1945 maps almost precisely onto what the next generation of American policymakers would spend decades trying to manage. The moment that crystallized Patton's transformation from a fighting general into a political problem came on September 22, 1945, at a press conference in Bad Thiels, Bavaria. For weeks, Patton had been chafing under the requirements of the denazification program in the American occupation zone. As military governor of Bavaria, he was responsible for implementing a policy that required the removal from any position of authority of anyone who had held membership in the Nazi Party. Patton's objection was not ideological indifference to Nazism. His experience at the concentration camps, he had visited both Ohrdruf and Buchenwald in April, and had been physically sickened by what he saw, meant that his revulsion at the Nazi system was not abstract. His objection was strategic. Under Hitler's system, party membership had been effectively compelled for vast numbers of ordinary Germans who needed to hold jobs, run businesses, or maintain professional licenses. Removing all of them simultaneously would, in Patton's analysis, make it functionally impossible to rebuild the German administrative and economic infrastructure that he believed the United States would urgently need as a buffer against Soviet expansion. He had written to Eisenhower as early as August making this argument in direct terms. He was told to implement the policy regardless of his reservations. He continued implementing it with visible and audible reluctance. At the press conference in September, reporters pressed him on his handling of former Nazis in the Bavarian administration. Patton's answer was incautious, dismissive, and politically catastrophic. He compared the argument over Nazi party members to a dispute between Republicans and Democrats. The exact nuance of what he meant was immediately buried under what the headlines said he meant. The political explosion was immediate. Eisenhower had protected Patton through the slapping incidents in Sicily. He had protected him through previous anti-Soviet remarks. But the context was different now. The war was over. There was no military urgency that required Patton's particular genius to be preserved at the cost of political embarrassment. On September 28, following a heated exchange, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. He was transferred to command of the 15th Army, a headquarters whose mission was not operational but historical, the documentation of the European campaign. Patton understood the transfer for exactly what it was. He wrote to his wife on October 15 that Eisenhower had sacrificed him for political expediency. He was certain that his assessments of the Soviet threat, his resistance to the denazification program's excesses, and his insistence on speaking what he believed to be the truth had made him too inconvenient for the political moment. He may not have been entirely wrong about that. What makes this turning point genuinely significant, rather than simply dramatic, is the precision of Patton's predictive record. The Soviet expansionism he warned about on VE Day materialized into the Iron Curtain within months. The argument he made about preserving German administrative capacity for use against the Soviet threat became, within a few years, a cornerstone of American policy, the same policy that produced the Marshall Plan and NATO. The men he was trying to protect, the soldiers still unaccounted for in Soviet territory, remained an unresolved issue that continued to generate declassified government reports for decades. He was relieved in September 1945. He died in December of the same year, following a car accident near Mannheim. He was 60 years old. He never went home. The historical vindication of Patton's post-victory analysis is uncomfortable precisely because it is so complete. The Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe that he warned about on May 8, 1945, hardened into permanent political division within 2 years. The countries whose fate he pointed to at that press conference, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, remained under Soviet-dominated governments for more than 4 decades. The line that the Yalta agreements had drawn, the line that Patton had protested being forced to stop behind, became the Iron Curtain. Churchill named it in March 1946. Patton had been describing its implications in May 1945, 10 months earlier. The question of American prisoners of war in Soviet-controlled territory remained a live issue in American government for decades after the war ended. Senate and House investigations in the 1990s, conducted after the Soviet archives became partially accessible, confirmed that the accounting of American POWs from the European theater was incomplete and that Soviet handling of the repatriation process had been inconsistent with the Yalta commitments. The precise fate of every unaccounted-for American soldier was not and has not been fully established. The surviving record does not close that question cleanly. What it does establish is that Patton's alarm about the reliability of Soviet compliance was not paranoia. It was observation. His denazification argument that removing all former party members simultaneously would collapse German administrative capacity was quietly abandoned and replaced by a more graduated approach within a few years of his removal. The logic he had articulated in his letters to Eisenhower became, in modified form, the policy of the occupation. He did not live to see any of this. He did not live to see the Berlin airlift, or NATO, or the long confirmation that the adversary he had identified in the spring of 1945 was exactly as dangerous as he had calculated. What he left behind was a body of writing. His diary, his letters, his partly censored memoir that describes the shape of the coming conflict with a clarity that few of his contemporaries matched. What Patton understood in May 1945 that very few people around him were willing to understand is something that takes on weight with distance. Victory in a war does not automatically produce security. It produces an opportunity. Whether that opportunity is used wisely depends on whether the people responsible for using it are willing to look at what is actually in front of them rather than at what they wish were in front of them. In the spring and summer of 1945, the political leadership of the Western democracies, exhausted by war and desperate for peace, chose the second option. They chose it with good intentions. The cost of that choice was paid over the following decades by people who had no part in making it. Patton was not a simple figure. He was impatient, politically reckless, and capable of genuine cruelty. His record contains real failures alongside his extraordinary achievements. The instinct that made him brilliant on a battlefield, the refusal to stop, the conviction that every problem could be solved by moving through it faster than the enemy expected, was also the instinct that made him impossible to manage in peacetime. He could not modulate. He could not wait. But on the central question of the spring and summer of 1945, whether the victory over Germany had resolved the strategic problem in Europe or had only changed its form, he was right. The war he saw when everyone else was celebrating was real. The men he was asking about were real. The power moving east of his halted lines was real. He told his staff on May 8, 1945, that the briefing that day would be the last in Europe. He told them he hoped there would be more briefings in Asia. What he did not say, at least not in that room, was what he had already written in his private correspondence and would repeat until the end of his life, that the peace being declared that morning was not the peace that the war had been fought to win. He was silenced before he could make that argument at full volume. He died before history had time to prove him correct. But history, given enough time, has a way of rendering verdicts that the politics of the moment cannot suppress forever. The war, George Patton said, was not over on May 8, 1945, did not officially end until November 9, 1989, when a wall built to contain exactly what he had described came down in Berlin without a shot being fired. He had named the problem 44 years before the world admitted it was solved.